A black boy saved a millionaire, and the millionaire made him a promise that he kept. The morning sun was just starting to rise, casting a golden hue over the bustling streets of Midtown. The world hummed with its usual energy, commuters rushing to work, street vendors shouting to sell their breakfast wares, and the steady rumble of city buses. Among the chaos, 12-year-old Darnell Johnson maneuvered his way through the crowd with a paper root bag slung across his shoulder. Darnell was a wiry, determined boy with deep brown eyes that held an intensity far beyond his years. Growing up in the rougher part of the city, life had never been easy. His mother, Elaine, worked tirelessly as a nurse at the local clinic, often pulling double shifts just to keep a roof over their heads. Darnell had taken it upon himself to contribute however he could, whether it was running errands for neighbors or delivering newspapers before school. This morning felt like any other as he zipped between pedestrians, his sneakers slapping against the cracked pavement. But as he approached the corner of a busy intersection near the city's financial district, something caught his eye. A man dressed in a sharp gray suit was crossing the street, oblivious to the roaring truck barreling toward him. The man was focused entirely on the phone pressed to his ear, his briefcase swinging in rhythm with his hurried steps. Time seemed to slow. Darnell saw the driver, distracted and fumbling with his coffee, and the truck speeding through a red light. The man had no idea what was coming. "Hey! Watch out!" Darnell shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the engine and the cacophony of the city. Without thinking, Darnell sprang into action. He dashed into the street, his small frame colliding with the man's larger one. The force of the impact sent them both tumbling onto the asphalt, just as the truck screeched past, missing them by mere inches. For a moment, there was silence. The man stared at Darnell, wide-eyed and stunned, his phone now lying forgotten a few feet away. "Are you okay?" Darnell asked, breathing heavily as he scrambled to his feet. His elbow throbbed from where it had scraped the ground, but he didn't care. The man sat up slowly, his face pale and his sharp features softened by the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Yes, I think so," he stammered. He looked at Darnell with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You saved my life." Darnell shrugged, his instincts telling him to play it cool, even though his heart was pounding in his chest. "You weren't paying attention," he said matter-of-factly. "Somebody had to do something." A small crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves and snapping pictures on their phones. The man stood, brushing off his tailored suit. Despite his polished appearance, there was an undeniable sincerity in his gaze as he looked down at Darnell. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. "Darnell," the boy replied, shifting awkwardly under the weight of the attention. "I'm Michael Bennett," the man said, extending his hand. "Thank you, Darnell. I owe you. Big time." Darnell hesitated before shaking Michael's hand. It felt strange, like stepping into a world he didn't belong to. "It's nothing," he mumbled. "Just glad you're okay." Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek business card, pressing it into Darnell's hand. "This is my number. If you ever need anything at all, call me. I mean it." Darnell stared at the card. Michael Bennett, CEO, Bennett Capital. The words meant little to him, but the weight of the gesture was clear. He nodded, tucking the card into his pocket. Before Michael could say more, Darnell picked up his paper root bag and melted back into the crowd, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. That night, as Darnell sat at the kitchen table eating a bowl of cereal for dinner, he couldn't shake the memory of the encounter. The card rested on the counter, its bold letters glinting in the dim light. He picked it up, running his fingers over the embossed logo. "Who was that man?" his mother asked, noticing the card. Elaine had just returned from her shift, exhaustion evident in her every movement. "Some guy I helped this morning," Darnell replied casually, though he couldn't hide the flicker of excitement in his voice. "He said I saved his life." Elaine frowned, her motherly instincts kicking in. "Darnell, you've got to be careful. The world's full of trouble, and you can't go running into the street like that." "I know, Mom," he said, brushing off her concern. "It's no big deal." But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the cracked ceiling, Darnell couldn't help but wonder. Who was Michael Bennett? And could someone like him really make good on a promise to a kid from a neighborhood like theirs? What Darnell didn't know was that Michael Bennett wasn't just grateful. He was determined. That night, as he sat in his penthouse apartment, sipping a glass of scotch, Michael made a decision. He would find a way to repay the boy who had saved his life, no matter what it took. Little did they both know, their lives were about to change in ways neither of them could imagine. The next morning, Darnell's life resumed its familiar rhythm. By the time the sun rose, he was already up and out, slinging newspapers from his trusty satchel. The streets felt a little busier than usual, and though he couldn't put his finger on it, Darnell sensed a shift in the air. The events of the previous day played in his mind, but he dismissed them as a one-off. People like Michael Bennett didn't come back for kids like him. He finished his route and trudged back to the apartment building, the familiar scent of Elaine's coffee wafting down the hall as he opened the creaky door to their two-room flat. "How's my favorite paperboy?" Elaine asked with a smile, balancing a stack of medical charts she'd brought home from the clinic. "Exhausted," Darnell replied, tossing his bag onto the worn-out couch. Scout, their scruffy mutt, padded over to greet him with a wagging tail. "Don't forget to finish your homework before dinner," Elaine reminded him. Darnell groaned in protest, but knew better than to argue. Life was hard enough for his mom without him adding to her stress. The day wore on uneventfully until early afternoon, when a knock at the door shattered the quiet. Elaine, still in her nurse's scrubs, wiped her hands on a towel and opened it cautiously. Standing in the hallway was a man dressed sharply in a navy blue suit, his salt-and-pepper hair perfectly combed. His presence seemed to shrink the dingy hallway, and Elaine's brow furrowed in suspicion. "Mrs. Johnson?" the man asked politely. "Yes," she replied, crossing her arms defensively. "Who's asking?" "I'm Michael Bennett," he said, flashing a disarming smile. "I believe your son and I met yesterday." Elaine stiffened. "Darnell?" she called over her shoulder. Darnell, who'd been sketching in his notebook on the couch, froze. He hadn't expected Michael to show up, especially not at their front door. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding, as he joined his mom. "Hey," he said awkwardly, avoiding Michael's piercing gaze. Michael's smile softened. "Hey, kid. Sorry to drop by unannounced, but I wanted to thank you properly for what you did." Elaine looked between them, her protective instincts on high alert. "What's this about?" Michael quickly explained the events of the previous day, downplaying the danger but emphasizing Darnell's bravery. Elaine's expression shifted from suspicion to a mixture of pride and worry as she listened. "You could have been killed," she scolded Darnell once Michael finished recounting the story. Darnell shrugged. "I wasn't." Michael cleared his throat, sensing the tension. "Mrs. Johnson, I understand how this might seem unusual, but your son saved my life. I owe him more than words can say." Elaine raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly do you want from him?" "Nothing," Michael said earnestly. "I came to offer help. Anything you and Darnell might need." "We're doing fine," Elaine said curtly, though the faint tremble in her voice betrayed the truth. Darnell glanced at his mom, recognizing her pride, but also knowing how hard she worked just to keep their heads above water. He decided to speak up. "Mr. Bennett said I could call him if I needed anything," he said quietly, pulling the card from his pocket. Michael nodded. "That offer still stands. I want to help, whether it's with school, housing, or anything else you need." Elaine hesitated, torn between gratitude and skepticism. "Why would someone like you care about us?" Michael's expression softened. "Because I know what it's like to need help," he admitted. "When I was younger, someone believed in me when no one else did. If I can pass that kindness on, I will." Elaine's eyes narrowed, but before she could respond, Darnell interjected. "Mom, he's serious. He means it." Michael smiled at Darnell, grateful for his faith. "I don't want to overstep," he said to Elaine. "But if you're open to it, I'd like to invite Darnell to see my office. No obligations, just a chance to show him what's possible." Elaine hesitated, her protective instincts battling with the hope in her son's eyes. Finally, she sighed. "Fine, but only if I come too." "Of course," Michael agreed, his smile widening. The next morning, Darnell and Elaine found themselves standing in front of Bennett Capitol, a gleaming skyscraper that seemed to pierce the clouds. Darnell craned his neck to take it all in, feeling small but excited. Michael greeted them in the lobby, his demeanor warm and welcoming. "Ready for the grand tour?" he asked, leading them through the building. Elaine remained reserved, but Darnell was captivated by everything he saw: the bustling offices, the rows of computers, and the view from Michael's penthouse office. "This is where it all happens," Michael said, gesturing to the sprawling cityscape below. "I worked my way up from nothing to build this." Darnell couldn't hide his awe. "You were like me?" he asked. Michael nodded. "Not exactly, but close enough. And if I can make it, so can you." As the tour continued, Michael shared stories of his struggles and successes, painting a picture of what hard work and determination could achieve. For the first time, Darnell began to imagine a future that looked different from the one he'd always known. By the end of the day, Elaine seemed less guarded. She shook Michael's hand firmly as they prepared to leave. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. Michael smiled. "The pleasure was mine." As they walked home, Darnell clutched a small notebook Michael had given him, filled with advice and encouragement. For the first time, he felt a spark of hope, a feeling that his life might just be headed in a new direction. The following weeks passed in a strange blur for Darnell. He continued his paper route, went to school, and helped his mom around the apartment, but everything felt different. The business card Michael had given him was tucked safely in his dresser drawer, a constant reminder that his life could change with a single call. Elaine had softened toward Michael after their visit to his office. She didn't fully trust him, but she couldn't deny the genuine interest he showed in helping Darnell. She often caught her son staring out the window or sketching in his notebook, his mind clearly elsewhere. One chilly afternoon, Darnell returned home from school to find Elaine coughing heavily at the kitchen sink. Her complexion was pale, and there was a weariness in her eyes that made his stomach twist. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, setting down his bag. Elaine straightened, forcing a smile. "Just a cold, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." But Darnell couldn't shake the unease that settled over him. He watched her closely over the next few days as her condition worsened. The coughing fits became more frequent, and she struggled to keep up with her long shifts at the clinic. One night, Elaine collapsed on her way to bed. Darnell panicked, calling an ambulance. At the hospital, the doctor's diagnosis hit Darnell like a punch to the gut: advanced pneumonia. Elaine needed round-the-clock care. and her recovery was uncertain. Darnell sat by her bedside, clutching her hand as tears welled in his eyes. "You're gonna get better, Mom," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Elaine squeezed his hand weakly. "You're my brave boy," she murmured. "No matter what happens, promise me you'll keep going." The weight of her words crushed him, but he nodded. "I promise." After 2 weeks in the hospital, Elaine's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. Late one night, Darnell was woken by a nurse, her expression kind but somber. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Darnell's world shattered. He sat by Elaine's empty bed for what felt like hours, unable to move or think. The person who had been his anchor, his guiding light, was gone. The next few days were a blur of grief and logistics. Social workers visited, asking questions about relatives or guardians. Darnell knew his mother's siblings, but they were caught up in lives he wanted no part of. Lives filled with addiction and instability. Desperate and unsure what to do, Darnell remembered the card in his dresser. His hands trembled as he dialed the number, the cool voice of Michael Bennett answering after just one ring. "Mr. Bennett," Darnell said, his voice cracking. "It's me, Darnell." Michael's tone shifted immediately to concern. "Darnell, what's wrong?" "It's my mom," he choked out. She passed." There was a pause, heavy with emotion. "Where are you?" Michael asked. "At the hospital. Stay there. I'm on my way." Michael arrived within an hour, his polished demeanor replaced by a somber gravity. He found Darnell sitting in the waiting area, clutching his knees to his chest. Without hesitation, Michael knelt in front of him. "I'm so sorry, Darnell," he said softly. Darnell nodded, his face buried in his arms. Michael gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll help you through this, okay? You're not alone." The words broke something inside Darnell, and he cried openly for the first time since his mother's death. The funeral was a modest affair, attended by a few neighbors and co-workers from the clinic. Michael stood by Darnell's side, ensuring everything was taken care of. He even covered the costs, though he insisted on doing so anonymously. Afterward, the social worker approached Darnell to discuss his living arrangements. "Your aunt and uncle have expressed interest in taking you in," she said, her tone cautious. Darnell's stomach turned. He knew what that meant. Living in a house filled with chaos, surrounded by people who cared more about their next fix than about him. "I can't go with them," he said firmly. The social worker frowned. "I understand your concerns, but—" Michael stepped forward, his voice steady. "He doesn't have to go anywhere he's not safe. If there's no one else suitable, I'd like to discuss other options." The social worker blinked, surprised. "You're suggesting—" "I'd like to take guardianship of Darnell," Michael said without hesitation, "if he's comfortable with that." Darnell stared at him, stunned. "You mean, I'd live with you?" Michael nodded. "If that's what you want. But only if you're sure." Tears welled in Darnell's eyes, and he nodded slowly. "I don't want to go with them. I want to go with you." The paperwork took weeks to finalize, but during that time, Michael began to include Darnell in his life. He took him on outings to museums, introduced him to books and ideas he'd never encountered before, and most importantly, gave him space to grieve. For the first time, Darnell felt like someone truly cared, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to. By the time the adoption was official, Darnell had begun to see Michael not just as a benefactor, but as family. The next chapter of Darnell's life was beginning, one filled with opportunity, hope, and the love of a man who had once been a stranger. And though he still missed his mother every day, He knew she would be proud of the choices he'd made and the life he was building. The first morning at Michael's sprawling estate felt surreal to Darnell. The mansion loomed before him like something out of a movie. Vast, pristine, and intimidating. Its stone facade gleamed in the morning sunlight, the manicured lawns stretching endlessly in every direction. For a boy used to cramped apartments and peeling walls, it was like stepping into another world. Michael walked beside him as they approached the front door. "Welcome home," he said warmly. Darnell hesitated. The word home didn't feel right. Not yet. Inside, the house was just as overwhelming. The marble floors gleamed, and sunlight streamed through towering windows. A grand staircase spiraled upward, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. "This place is huge," Darnell managed, his voice small. Michael chuckled. "It can feel that way at first, but you'll get used to it." A woman approached, her steps brisk but graceful. She was dressed in a tailored suit, her gray hair pulled into a neat bun. "This is Mrs. Hargrove," Michael said, introducing her. "She keeps the house running smoothly." Mrs. Hargrove offered a kind smile. "Welcome, Darnell. If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to ask." Darnell nodded, still unsure how to respond. Michael led him to his room, a spacious suite with a king-sized bed, a desk, and a view of the garden. Darnell noticed a stack of books and a brand-new laptop on the desk. "I thought you might need some supplies for school," Michael said. "And if there's anything else you need, let me know." Darnell's eyes widened. "This is all for me?" Michael nodded. "You deserve a fresh start, Darnell. This is just the beginning." Over the next few days, Darnell tried to adjust to his new life. Michael enrolled him in a prestigious private school, a stark contrast to the underfunded public school he was used to. On his first day, Michael drove him to campus in a sleek black car. As they pulled up, Darnell's nerves were palpable. The students milling around wore crisp uniforms, their conversations buzzing with energy and confidence. "You'll do great," Michael said, sensing Darnell's hesitation. Darnell nodded, though he wasn't so sure. Inside the classroom, he felt like an outsider. The other kids seemed to know each other, their polished appearances a stark contrast to his worn sneakers and hesitant demeanor. He focused on his work, trying to avoid attention. Michael, meanwhile, found himself grappling with his own challenges. Balancing his demanding career with the responsibilities of raising a grieving boy was no small feat. He sought advice from friends, read parenting books, and attended therapy sessions to better understand how to support Darnell. During one session, Michael opened up to his therapist. "I'm terrified of failing him," he admitted. "I've spent my life building a business, but raising a child? That's uncharted territory." The therapist nodded. "It's natural to feel that way. But remember, Darnell doesn't need you to be perfect. He needs you to be present, to show up for him." One evening, after dinner, Michael found Darnell in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath the stars. "Mind if I join you?" Michael asked. Darnell shrugged. "Sure." They sat in silence. For a moment, the cool night air wrapping around them. "How's school?" Michael asked. "It's different," Darnell said. "The kids there, they're not like me." Michael nodded. "That's true, but that doesn't mean you don't belong. You're just as smart and capable as any of them." Darnell hesitated. "It's hard. I feel like I'm always trying to catch up." Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've already overcome more challenges than most kids your age. That resilience will take you far." As the weeks passed, Darnell began to find his footing. He discovered a love for science, his teachers praising his natural curiosity, and determination. Slowly, he made a few friends, kids who admired his humor and creativity. Michael, true to his promise, continued to support Darnell in every way he could. He attended parent-teacher conferences, cheered him on at school events, and spent weekends exploring the city with him. For the first time in years, Darnell felt a sense of stability. He still missed his mom deeply, but he began to see Michael not just as a benefactor, but as someone who genuinely cared. One Saturday, Michael surprised Darnell with a trip to a science museum. As they wandered through the exhibits, Darnell's eyes lit up with excitement. "This is so cool," he said, studying a display about space exploration. Michael smiled. "I thought you might like it. You've got a sharp mind, Darnell. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll work for NASA." Darnell laughed. "Me? At NASA? Why not?" Michael said. "Dream big. You're capable of more than you realize." Darnell looked at him, a spark of hope in his eyes. For the first time, he began to believe it might be true. That night, as Darnell lay in bed, he reflected on how much his life had changed. He still had doubts, fears, and moments of sadness, but he also had something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. And for that, he was grateful. Months passed, and the bond between Darnell and Michael deepened. Their relationship, though unconventional, grew stronger through shared experiences and mutual respect. Darnell was thriving at school, his natural intelligence earning him praise from teachers and sparking a newfound confidence. However, shadows of the past lingered. The loss of his mother still weighed heavily on Darnell's heart, and there were moments when the grief felt insurmountable. One evening, as the first whispers of autumn swept through the garden, Michael found Darnell sitting on the same stone bench they had shared before. He was holding an old photo, his thumb tracing the worn edges. "Mind if I join you?" Michael asked gently. Darnell nodded without looking up. "It's my mom," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I miss her." Michael sat beside him, his gaze softening. "I know, Darnell. It's okay to miss her. She was an incredible woman." Darnell sniffed, wiping at his eyes. "I keep thinking about how things were before, how hard she worked, how much she gave up for me. I feel like I didn't do enough for her." Michael's heart ached for the boy. "Darnell, your mom knew how much you loved her. She was proud of you. She worked so hard because she believed in you and wanted to give you the best she could." Darnell looked up, his eyes glistening with tears. "But I didn't save her. I couldn't do anything when she got sick." Michael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You were a child, Darnell. You did everything you could just by being there for her. And now, you honor her by living the life she wanted for you." The conversation was a turning point. Over the next few weeks, Darnell began to embrace therapy sessions that Michael had arranged. Though hesitant at first, he soon found that talking about his feelings helped ease the burden he carried. During one session, Darnell shared a memory that had been haunting him. "I remember when my mom got the diagnosis," he said, his voice trembling. "She didn't cry. She just held my hand and said, 'We'll get through this together.' I didn't know how she could be so strong." The therapist nodded. "She was strong because she loved you, Darnell. And that same strength is in you. It's okay to feel sad, but remember, she would want you to move forward and be happy." Meanwhile, Michael faced challenges of his own. Balancing his demanding career with raising Darnell wasn't easy, and there were moments when he doubted his ability to be the father figure the boy needed. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, Michael found himself losing his temper over something trivial. Darnell had accidentally spilled juice on an important document Michael had left on the kitchen table. "I told you to be careful," Michael snapped, his voice sharper than he intended. Darnell froze, his face falling. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, quickly grabbing a towel to clean the mess. Michael sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "It's fine. Just be more mindful next time." The tension hung heavy in the air. Later that night, as Michael sat in his study, guilt gnawed at him. He realized he had let his frustration overshadow his role as a mentor and caregiver. The next morning, he approached Darnell, who was sitting at the breakfast table quietly eating cereal. "Hey," Michael began, his tone softer. "About last night." "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have snapped at you, that wasn't fair." Darnell looked up, surprised. "It's okay," he said, though his voice was hesitant. "No, it's not," Michael insisted. "You've been through enough. The last thing you need is me making things harder. I'm learning too, Darnell. I'm trying to be better for you." The boy offered a small smile, and the tension eased. As the months turned into a year, Darnell and Michael found a rhythm in their lives together. Darnell excelled in school, his confidence growing with each achievement. Michael attended every school event, cheering the loudest at science fairs and soccer games. One day, as they were cleaning out the garage, they stumbled upon an old bicycle. Its paint was chipped and the tires were flat, but Darnell's eyes lit up. "Think it still works?" he asked, running his hand over the handlebars. Michael chuckled. "Not in its current state, but we can fix it up." The project became a bonding experience. Together, they sanded down the rust, repainted the frame, and replaced the worn tires. When the bike was finally ready, Darnell beamed with pride. "This is awesome," he said, climbing onto the seat. "You earned it," Michael replied, watching as Darnell pedaled down the driveway, his laughter echoing in the crisp evening air. Though life wasn't perfect, it was filled with moments of joy and growth. Darnell began to see Michael not just as the man who had stepped in when he needed help, but as someone who genuinely cared for him. One night, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Darnell turned to Michael and said, "Thanks for everything. I know I don't say it enough, but I'm glad you're here." Michael's chest tightened with emotion. "I'm glad you're here too, Darnell. You've changed my life as much as I've changed yours." They shared a smile, the kind that spoke volumes without words. Darnell's journey wasn't over, and neither was Michael's. But together, they were learning what it meant to heal, to grow, and to create a future filled with hope. And for the first time in a long time, they both felt like they were exactly where they belonged. Time seemed to flow like a steady river, carrying with it the memories of struggle and triumph. What began as a single act of courage on a crowded street had blossomed into a story of growth, transformation, and hope. Darnell stood in front of a full-length mirror, carefully adjusting the tassel on his graduation cap. The reflection staring back at him wasn't just a young man. It was a testament to perseverance and the unbreakable bond that had formed between him and Michael. The auditorium was set, the stage waiting for him to deliver his valedictorian speech, a moment he had worked toward with relentless determination. Michael entered the room with an easy smile, his eyes gleaming with pride. "You ready to knock their socks off?" Darnell chuckled, the butterflies in his stomach settling slightly. "I think so. But you know, it's a big crowd." Michael placed a hand on Darnell's shoulder, his expression softening. "If anyone can handle it, it's you. You've got a story worth sharing, and the world deserves to hear it." Darnell paused, his gaze falling to his cap and gown. "You think Mom would be proud?" Michael didn't hesitate. "She'd be over the moon. and not just proud, grateful. She'd see everything she ever wanted for you in this moment. Those words settled in Darnell's heart as they left for the ceremony, their bond palpable. The auditorium buzzed with excitement. Families, friends, and faculty filled every seat, their voices mingling in a chorus of anticipation. Darnell waited backstage, his speech clutched tightly in his hand. When his name was called, the applause was thunderous, and the sound sent a jolt of nerves and exhilaration through him. Stepping up to the podium, he looked out over the sea of faces. His gaze landed briefly on Michael, seated in the front row, giving him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, Darnell began. "Good evening, everyone. Today isn't just about celebrating the end of a journey. It's about honoring the people and moments that made it possible. My journey began in a way I never expected, and it changed my life forever." He went on to share his story, not as a tale of hardship, but as a testament to the power of connection, courage, and second chances. He spoke about his mother's strength, Michael's unwavering support, and the hope that had carried him through the darkest days. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. Michael clapped the hardest, his hands stinging but his heart full. After the ceremony, Darnell found Michael waiting for him amidst the crowd of jubilant graduates and their families. "You nailed it," Michael said, pulling him into a hug. "Thanks," Darnell replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Michael pulled back, looking at him with a mixture of pride and affection. "You could have. You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I just gave you a little nudge." Life didn't slow down after graduation. If anything, it picked up pace as Darnell pursued his dream of community development, determined to give others the opportunities he'd been afforded. Michael, now semi-retired, found new purpose in helping Darnell launch programs aimed at supporting underprivileged youth. Together, they created the Claire Reynolds Foundation, named in honor of Darnell's mother. It provided scholarships, mentorship, and essential resources to families in need. The foundation became a beacon of hope for the city, a testament to what could be achieved when compassion met action. One day, as they stood at the grand opening of a new community center, Darnell turned to Michael. "Do you ever think about how all this started?" Michael smiled, his gaze sweeping over the children laughing and playing in the newly built space. "Every single day. It's amazing how one moment can change everything." Darnell nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad I decided to run into the street that day, even if it scared the life out of me." Michael laughed, the sound warm and full of gratitude. "Me too. Life's funny like that. Sometimes the scariest moments lead to the best things." As the evening light bathed the city in gold, Darnell and Michael sat on the steps of the community center, watching families enjoy the fruits of their labor. "I've been thinking," Darnell said, breaking the comfortable silence. "We should dedicate the center to Mom." Michael's smile widened, his eyes glistening. "The Claire Reynolds Community Center. It's perfect. She'd love that." Darnell felt a swell of emotion. His mother's legacy wasn't just preserved, it was thriving, reflected in every brick of the building and every smile it brought to the people who entered. Later that night, as they walked back home under a sky full of stars, Michael spoke quietly. "You know, Darnell, you didn't just save my life that day. You gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing. A purpose." Darnell looked at him, his voice steady. "And you gave me hope when I didn't think I had any left. We saved each other, Michael." Michael placed a hand on Darnell's shoulder, his expression tender. "We sure did." And as they walked on side by side, They knew that their story wasn't just about redemption or second chances. It was about building a future that shined brighter because of the struggles they had overcome together. Thank you for being part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales of hope, resilience, and the extraordinary power of human connection. What would you do if life gave you a second chance? Share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear your story.